About a week and a half ago, an apartment building known as the Davenport Hotel in Iowa partially collapsed along its west wall, killing 3 people and injuring others. The west wall was structurally modified about 3.5–4 months ago, which will be the bulk of the second video that I will release on this building collapse. But it's important to know that work has been done on this building and that it was not structurally repaired in as much as it was modified, and we'll break that down later. Immediately after that structural modification project, the walls around the area that they addressed began to rapidly degrade. And then currently, right before the collapse actually occurred, they were having new repairs done in order to address this rapid degradation that was going on. I want to give a shout out to Louie and Hannah for turning me onto this and sending me some of the initial information that made it into my investigation. Thanks, guys. Okay, a little background on the building. The building was constructed in 1907, designed in 1906, so that makes it about 116 years old. The structure is comprised primarily of steel columns, steel beams, but along the west face of the building, the steel beams rest on a structural brick facade. So this was a practice that was used around the time where they didn't have CMU, they didn't have reinforced concrete that they were using. And so if you wanted to build a tall building, you essentially just used red clay brick and you just continued adding layer after layer after layer, which we call widths. And so if you can build up the widths wide enough, and then you can build it up tall enough, and then the steel beams just come and sit on top of that. Now this building had, at least for the last 30 plus years, has had a history of problems, mostly considered non-structural. We're talking water intrusion, smells, vagrants, security, just all sorts of problems. You can Google it and look it up online, and there's some other people on YouTube that have kind of covered this, and some news reports that have covered the history of problems with this building. But none of them that I have found really rose to the level of being a primary structural concern. Early this year in February, a structural engineer was called out to look at some of the facade issues that were going on with the west wall, some crumbling and some degradation that was going on. By the end of February, they had conducted a couple site visits, and they observed a large void and bulging of brick outside of some old CMU wall repair. I'll show that a little bit later in this presentation, which kind of shows that the loads were already beginning to shift even while they were doing their repair project. The other thing of interest is then you fast forward, they finished up that work in February and March, this project, which again, I'm not going to get too much into the details of the structural modification project they did because that's really the heart of the second video. But I just kind of want to give you the timeline here. So then in May, those repairs are complete, and now there's new brick bulging and new problems showing up around the repair area. May 25th, the city inspector photographs some serious deleterious conditions with the facade and the actual structure of the building, and then 3 days later, the building collapses. And now it's important to know, again, that there's a partial collapse, not the whole building collapsed, but that west face of the wall where they were working had collapsed. And it's really important to know that the days leading up to it, there was actually a contractor who had bid on the job and wasn't awarded the job because he wanted to do additional work. My guess is to probably provide additional safety and security on the job, because this gentleman started visiting the site, he claims, every day as the project was going on, even though he wasn't awarded the job. And as he saw the conditions deteriorating, he was trying to warn people that this building was in imminent risk of collapsing. So again, this is just what I'm picking up from the news cycle and from his words to these reporters, but I haven't had a chance to talk to this gentleman myself personally. So let's dig into the visuals. Let's start talking about this, and let's start breaking this down, and let's see if we can't make sense of this. Okay, we're going to first look at some aerial images that were shot with a drone immediately after the collapse. I mean, they don't even have the site cordoned off, really. No looky-loos there, no police there. So this is like whoever got out there with this drone got out there really quick. There's some things I just want you to note, because we're going to spend a lot of time looking at this. What you're looking at is the partial collapse of the west face. So, to kind of give you some orientation, the north is essentially this way, and we are trying to orient ourselves to where everything is. So if you notice, like a lot of what we're going to be talking about and looking at is like window count from this south corner over here. So we're going to be really interested, we're going to be looking at window 1, 2, 3. So it's like, you can see where this kind of stops and starts. It just helps you to orient yourself. Notice that the break in the wall at this location here is right at a window. You can actually see all of the window trim around the windows on the outside. So it like broke right at the window mark. And then looking at the next sheet or next picture here, you can see that a couple interesting things here. It also broke at all the window locations here. So you basically lost the header and you lost the windows that went with the header. And from this picture, I want you to notice this looks like a large steel drum or something down here at the bottom of the image. That's going to be important when I show you the original construction drawings to kind of orient where that is and what that is. It's referred to as a stack on the 1906 drawings. There's not a lot of information given to what they mean by stack, but it appears to be like a utility chase or maybe a plumbing chase, but I believe it was mostly a utility chase. Also of importance in this picture is you can see these steel column lines, okay? So the steel columns go all the way up the building, and I have some better examples of that. If you kind of look around at an angle where the drone kind of got around at a different angle here, you'll notice that where the break stops on this side of the building, okay, that there is a wall here. It's a little difficult to see, so I went ahead and zoomed in. But you have these wall elements here, essentially, okay? And at every floor, you've got this wall that did not go with the rest of it. It almost appears to function kind of like a shear wall, maybe, okay? And you can kind of see that it even still has all of its drywall and everything is still on that wall surface. Now, this stuff here is slabs that have fallen from that unit and slabs that have fallen from that unit and the framing that go to those slabs and whatnot. But essentially, the one thing I kind of want you guys to realize is like, why did we'll get into deeper dive into like, why did this building partially collapse? But I think this is going to be important for answering, well, why didn't the whole thing collapse? Because this goes into the question of, is this building stable? And does it need to be demolished like the city wants to do? And is this something that matters or what? So we're going to show you kind of looking at the original structural drawings, looking at what happened, how it happened, and hopefully kind of answer some of those questions. Okay, so this was a picture taken after the February and March structural modification to the building. The facade started falling off like crazy. Like the building started getting under way more stress after that structural modification was made, and facade started falling off. This image here was taken by the contractor that I had told you about earlier in the video, and it shows that the other contractor had put up some very, poorly designed bracing, but this bracing isn't structural and it's not for the wall. It's actually for the brick facade. So you have to understand that this brick, there's two important elements to the wall of the west wall that we're going to be talking about in this video series. We are talking about the facade, which is typically a hard red clay brick. They painted it red. You can see all the red paint on the brick there. But the other element of the wall that's important is the actual structural brick wall, which had multiple widths of brick layers, or you can think of them as layers, to build that out to be a very thick wall. So what you are seeing around these areas is that the facade has been removed from those areas, and you are looking at the structural brick wall. Now, if you're looking at this picture and you're wondering, well, if this is a structural brick wall, why do I have a giant hole in the wall? That would be a really good question, right? And this is going to be super important as we start analyzing the collapse video and stuff like that. But the other thing I want you to take away from this particular photograph, taken, I believe, a few days before the collapse, is that just like you have these window locations over here, and it's got like an arch above it at the top, on the right side of the image, they used to have these windows back in the day, and at some point in its 116-year history, somebody had infilled it with masonry. Okay, so there's 3 or 4 window locations over here along, and it goes past the image, where they have infilled those old windows with masonry block, CMU block. But it's really important to know that you see this big gap here between the arch of the red clay brick and the masonry, the gray CMU masonry. They weren't touching. So this CMU is literally what we call non-structural infill. In other words, the loads from this building going down do not transfer into these masonry, these CMU. So all of these loads actually flow into the columns. All the weight of the building up above flows into the columns. Okay? Just like this. You got to imagine the force lines in a building like water flowing, and it's going to flow to the densest, stiffest materials, and it's going to flow where load can actually be transferred. Well, now that you understand that these things aren't actually doing anything, okay, now you can kind of begin to understand that these areas of brick are actually like columns. They're brick columns. Now that you understand it's a brick column, are you worried at all about the giant hole in the column? Because I am, and I think the contractor who took this picture was very worried about it too. All right, so let's take a look at the original construction drawings. There's not many sheets out there available for the public to look at. There's a historic museum or something in Iowa, records office. I'm not going to go to Iowa to go look at these things and scan them or photograph them. But there was a few partial photographs on the web, and I was able to confirm that these do match the building. They match the structure. They belong to this building. And this drawing here is of the second floor. So again, the orientation now, this is north. All right. And so I've kind of drew some graphics up along the west wall, which I will get into in a minute. But just kind of orienting yourself. This is like a hallway that you would walk through. And these are old, they called them servants' rooms back then. And because they were very small, and I think a lot of the laborers and workers that lived there would have lived there, while they were working there. And anyway, so they've converted this building, obviously, a long time ago from a hotel into an apartment building. But just sort of giving you the orientation of where things are. We're talking about this area towards the back of the building. Okay. Now, zooming in on that area, I want to kind of go through some of the nomenclature and some of the things I identified. Okay. So circled in red. And you can see that they have the letters C1 or the designations C1, C2, C3. These are arbitrary. There is no column lines and beam lines or anything like that in these drawings from 1906. So I went ahead and just labeled the columns myself. So they're arbitrarily chosen, whether they're C1, C2, or whatever. But starting from the left, you've got C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, and C6. These are steel columns. They go from the foundation all the way up to the roof, all right? So these are what we refer to as column lines. Now, in the green color between the columns are beams. And you have beams going from column to column, which are these here. And then you have beams that are going from columns or from these other beams to the exterior facade. And so you have those beams here, 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 and here. So this is what is a little bit interesting about the construction of this building that we don't do anymore, is that instead of putting steel columns inside the wall and then just encasing it in brick, these steel beams actually sit inside pockets inside the brick. So they just bear directly on the brick wall for 6 floors above. You have to understand, 6 floors and the roof. And these beams come in and they bear on that wall, every floor all the way up. 2 other things I want to note real quick. One, I've highlighted it in blue here, is what they label on the drawing as the stack. This perfectly lines up with that steel drum that we saw in the collapse photographs. I pointed that out to you earlier in the video, so just keep a note on that and where that's located. And then the other thing that's interesting is I pointed out and made some effort to make sure you understood that there was, where the collapse ended along the north end of the collapse, that there was like this wall there, and it looks almost like a shear wall or something. But in the original drawings, it is referred to as Truss D. I don't have details. I don't have any information on what that means or what they implied by Truss D. I will say, though, if you look at these drawings, that they constructed a wall on each side of Truss D. Okay, so this thing, in other words, it's not like a beam. It's a full height, some sort of assemblage. I don't know if it's wood, steel, I don't know what it is, but it's some sort of assemblage. And if you look at the collapse area, okay, what actually collapsed, this area here, well, I should modify that. The area just north of all the steel columns collapsed. I'm sorry, not north, but west. Just west of all the steel columns. This is the area that collapsed. And it stopped right at this truss D location here. And all of these steel columns are still there. Every single one. The whole column line is still there. So where you had steel to steel welded, and you had all these steel beams between the steel columns, they're all there. The only things that actually collapsed were the steel beams that went and sat on the brick facade, because the brick facade is the Achilles heel. It's the thing that actually collapsed, and when that brick facade collapsed, it took all of these beams down with it. And you can see those in the photos in a lot of cases, that those beams bent down and collapsed, and it took obviously all of this plumbing area and the floor here as well. Okay, there's a reason I used the colors that I used for this area. It's because I wanted to be able to make sure you understood the orientation. Again, we're looking this way is north, and I want to make sure that you are able to transfer that to this next image, okay? So again, yellow, green, and the red. Now here we don't see the red anymore because the steel columns are deeper into the building. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you that the yellow dots essentially represent where a steel beam comes and sits and pockets into this brick wall, the structural brick wall. I only drew some of the beams in here, but these green lines represent the green beams that go deeper back into the building that I showed you on the previous plan. The blue area here represents the blue stack, as the drawing called it, which was like a brick surround around a utility stack that went through the building. And so this shows you kind of just how many beams we're talking about, all right? And this is just how many beams, just how many pockets, and every single one of these beams, and remember, there's a beam everywhere, a beam for each of these, okay? Every single one of these beams is carrying the floor load for that area that I showed you before, and that floor load is being transferred down into the brick facade, okay? So it spreads because there's no steel column in the brick. This is I can't emphasize this enough. This is something that was missed, I believe, by the engineer that worked on this building recently. A failure to actually understand what that means when there's no steel column line in this. Every single individual beam pocket distributes its load directly to the brick. Very important. This is different because if I had a steel column line, okay, I can lose, in theory, I could lose these, and this load in this column line would continue straight down. Okay, it would just continue going straight down to the foundation. But because I don't actually have a column line, okay, if I lose support here, all of this load needs to transfer to where I do have support. It's got to go around the problem, okay, which then means that you end up like overloading the areas that do have support. And again, this will probably make more sense in a little bit. All right, so now let's kind of take what we've learned about the steel column lines and stuff, and you can see I've laid over the steel column lines and I've put a blue line. So I put a blue circle around that drum. Again, this is what's called the stack. So I'm just trying to keep your orientation throughout this whole presentation. And then you can see the column lines. Now these column lines comport with C4, C5, and C6. Okay, so you can't see really C3, 2, and 1. And then of course this right here, now you understand, is what is referred to as truss D, and it has wall sheathing on both sides, which we can't see inside right now. And I don't have full access to the drawings, so I don't know necessarily what truss D is. But this sort of shows you that, you know, when you're looking at the area that I mentioned before that had collapsed, okay, you can now visually compare that to this area here is our area of collapse. And then that comports with this. And again, I messed up actually. Here's your area of collapse. It goes to that column line. Sorry. All right. So, and the reason why you got to double check, this is why I say you got to double check things from the beginning, because you've got 1, 2, 3 window stacks here, and the break is at the 4th stack. So you want to make sure that you are consistent with that, where you say, okay, I've got my first window, got my second window, got my third window. The break is at this window stack. So now you understand that it's actually these beams here did not collapse. They were not part of that collapse. All right, the last thing I want to point out in this image that I forgot to mention before is if you look at these 3 white areas down here, those match the area that I showed you in the very recent photograph right before it collapsed that the contractor had taken, showing that masonry inside those old window openings. And so that's really important to continue reminding yourself that these do not take load. They're non-bearing, they're non-structural, they're just infill, and they're not taking any load whatsoever, as far as we can tell and based on all of the evidence that we have at hand. Okay. All right. So we're going to take a second now, and I'm going to show the video from a cam. I'm sure if you have any interest in this case, you've already seen it, the actual collapse of this thing. I'm going to go ahead and show you that now, and then we're going to kind of break it down a little bit frame by frame. Okay, so as we break down this video, I'm hoping that I don't lose any of you, because this starts getting, I'm trying to ease you all into the nitty-gritty details. The second video is going to be more complex, so I'm trying to lay down the groundwork so that we kind of all understand what's happening. All right, a lot of you guys have seen the collapse video, but there's actually little pieces of facade that were falling several minutes before the actual full-on collapse. This shot here is of a chunk of the facade that fell off. Now, I want to orient you a little bit to the images. They are in sequence, so there's not a specific number of frames between them, but it's very short. It's like 1-2 frames between each one. But this is the first image, second image, third image, and fourth image in chronological order. All right, in the first image, what we're looking at is we're looking at an area of facade right here. And it is located just to the lower right of this window, which is 2 windows over from the door. Okay, so here is the door entrance on that west door, and there's those 2 windows above it that I put through that line. And then the 2 windows over, you have this piece of facade. And so in the sequence 1, you can see where the facade is located, and then you can see that there's a gap that opens up as the facade tips, and then the facade this chunk of facade is beginning to fall down, and then here it is down here. It has fallen off of this location in sequence number 4. This location matches this location and you got to remember, I'm using a 2017, so the note at the top right says 2017 visual condition, which is true. This photo is of 2017, but I'm using it as a pre-collapse photo example so that we can kind of understand and orient ourselves. So in this red blob that I circled, this is the first chunk of facade that fell off in that video sequence. And then about a minute, I want to say 1.5 minutes goes by, and then the rest of the collapse sequence begins, which happens over a course of like 15-20 seconds or something like that. All right, so at the beginning of that sequence that I'm now talking about, where things started rapidly falling apart, I want you to look, again, we have a sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4 in chronological order. And the main thing here that happened, the next thing that happened on this site before it full-on collapsed, is the column. Remember that column I showed you before with the hole next to it? Well, that hole is this little dark dot right there. Hopefully I can, it's kind of small, I know, on your screen, especially if you're watching on phone. But that black dot kind of represents that hole in the column. So the rest of that column next to the door is right here, okay? That's that column area. And now what we're seeing is that black dot is not as easily seen anymore because the brick right above it has collapsed and there's dust and stuff in this frame of the image, so it's hard to see. And then more of that brick actually falls down and outward. Okay, so it's got that down and out movement. So it's collapsing down and then kicking out. Okay, and that's why you can now see a bit more of dark spots in this area, in this column line area. And when it all finally collapses, I took of that one column. Once that one column initial sort of chunk of brick falls, you can see now that you have a much bigger hole, right? This black line here is a much bigger hole compared to what we started with this small hole in frame 1 of this sequence. All right, so going back, I've highlighted in red the area that I've highlighted in red the area that fell, which is this area that I just circled. And that is the second piece that fell. I went ahead and left the graphics for the first piece that fell, and then this is the second piece that fell. And so I put up this picture of the column. Again, it's not technically a column, but it's like a column of brick, right? It's a chunk of brick that supports load. So all this load from here comes down, and the load from here comes down. And so if you go back to that sequence, the small hole starts off with this. That's the small hole. And then by the end of that sequence, man, I'm going all over the place. Sorry. By the end of that sequence, you end up with this much larger hole in that column line, which basically means that all of this fell out. Okay. And then that is literally like seconds before the rest of the building collapses. So now I'm going to start showing overlays of this area as the frames continue. Okay, the next chunk to fall off the building was this piece of brick facade here. And this piece was actual facade. You can see the dust cloud that's being created in this still frame on the side. I'm not going to show you sequences anymore. I don't feel like we need to break it down frame by frame. But this next piece of dust, this is the next thing that collapsed. So now you've got location 1, you've got location 2, and then you've got location 3 is the third thing that collapsed, fell off of this building, I should say, to be a little bit more accurate. Okay, now the immediate, like, complete total collapse of this thing. This is like probably frame 2 of the entire facade just coming off of this building. And one of the things I want you to note is there's like this location here has this like bellied shape to it. I'm not going to go and play the thing forward and backward really slow for you a bunch, but needless to say, the remaining side of the column, which I've circled in, or I've highlighted in this like purple color down here, the rest of that column blew out. Like it literally just like exploded out from having way too much load on top of what was remaining there. It just couldn't handle the load. So this thing actually bows and blows out from this column line. I mean, literally like at the exact same second, you end up seeing the facade drop. And I've played this frame back over and over and over again. I left the windows off, but the windows up here at the top, if you look at the top arches of those windows, all 3 of those windows drop. And within one frame, they drop with each other. And they all drop about a frame or 2 before this wall buckles here at this window. And so what you have is you have this column blows out, okay? And then you have essentially a sequential at the same exact time, this chunk of wall blows out, also in purple here. I'd say about a frame later, it blows out. And when that happens, concurrently with that, the entire facade just starts dropping. And that's why I put these purple and red arrows here. The whole thing just starts dropping in a sheet, and it ends up folding this window over here on the right. It folds the brick facade there because at that point the structure's gone and the whole collapse commences. Now, last thing I want to point out, again, this is sort of an analysis on what collapsed and I can't get into too much why it collapsed. I mean, I think some of it's obvious, right? It's like, oh, well, the brick was really deteriorated. It was in bad shape. There was a hole in it. Why was there a hole in it? I think one of the things to keep in mind is, yes, deterioration played a contributing factor, contributing role. But I don't believe it's just coincidence that the rear of the building was structurally modified and then the rest of it just started rapidly deteriorating. And when I go back and I look into those structural details and structural drawings that the engineer prepared earlier this year, it raises some alarms, like some serious alarms. And it's just too much to get into in this video, which is why, unfortunately, I'm going to have to save it for the second video. But this last frame I want to show you. Here's all the things, right? Here's all of the pieces that started falling. Here's the blowout at the column. The blowout at this arch, okay, and then the entire facade comes down in this collapse. But what you have to remember is this area here was structurally modified in February and March. And we're going to go into the details of how they did that structural modification in the second video, and it's really kind of alarming, some of the things that they missed in the oversight, or the lack of understanding, I think, in how this whole system works. When they originally set out to do this project, they were only going to do this much a modification of the wall. And what I mean by modification is this area of the wall that I just X'd out was an area that was showing kind of bad brick facade damage. When they started doing this work, they then discovered that there was a fourth window here that was filled in with masonry. And so they kind of incorporated that into part of their repair as well. But as soon as that repair work was done, the rest of the building just started deteriorating. I mean, rapidly. The rest of this area didn't look like it did until immediately after this structural modification was done. And so I wanted to kind of just go through the basics. There's been a lot of people talking about the collapse. Obviously, there's been a lot of news stations covering this. I'm sure there's other YouTubers covering this and stuff. But I kind of wanted to make sure that everybody had an understanding structurally of what's going on. And the final thing I kind of want to point out, at least in this video, is that if you go back to how I laid out the fact that those structural steel columns are all still there, and that the only thing that actually failed and collapsed was the brick facade on the west, yeah, there may be some other damage throughout the building, but this area that collapsed is actually structurally isolated from the rest of the building. It's like a different beast, a different animal. You have that truss D where the collapse stopped. You have a concentration of steel columns. You have 2 extra steel columns over at the south side of the building where the collapse stopped. And then none of the steel columns that were immediately inward of the collapse actually collapsed themselves, according to the pictures I have available. So to me, I think it's a little early to just say, hey, let's demo this building. Because in my opinion, this site is probably a crime scene. It actually is a crime scene. I don't know if a crime was actually committed, but it's definitely a crime scene and it definitely needs investigated. Well, tell me what you guys think, and do you think they should have torn down the building or should tear down the building, or do you think that further investigation should be done? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about how these kinds of structures work and maybe develop some of the same scientific foundations I use in my investigations, then try 𝙈𝙤𝙀𝙁. 𝙈𝙤𝙀 has a 30-day free trial, so there is no risk to trying it out and beginning your journey to better STEM skills today. Content is updated monthly in subjects like scientific thinking, logic, and applied computer science, and new subjects are being added all the time. Using the 𝙈𝙤𝙀 app is about developing a deeper understanding of how the world works from a scientific perspective. The content is hands-on and allows you to learn by interacting with puzzles and lessons in an accessible and fun way. You can learn at your own pace, and new content is added all the time to keep you learning for life. We're all busy and on the run these days, but we always seem to find time to kill on our phones between meetings or while hanging out relaxing. Why not use that time learning something useful? And don't forget, you can gift a subscription to someone else too. This could be a great way to share 𝙈𝙀𝙀 with a family member or close friend. To try everything 𝙈𝙀𝙀 has to offer free for a full 30 days, go to 𝙈𝙀𝙀.org/building-integrity. And the first 200 of you that sign up will get 20% off of your premium annual subscription. Thanks for watching.